Let's have a look at React Transition Group. You can simply Google for it to find the GitHub repository of this package. Now, this package is not an official React package or not by the React team, but it's a package created by the vibrant React community. And it is a package which allows you to smoothly animate elements when they are added and removed to and from the DOM. Let's check out the main documentation. There you'll see how to install it, and then it also describes how it works and how it's used. Feel free to dive deeper into this to really see all possible use cases and what else you can do with that. But of course, I'll also show you how we may use it together over the next lectures. First of all, let's install it with this npm install React Transition Group save command. I copy that, I'll quit my npm start process, paste this in, and simply run it to now install and store this package in this project here. And of course, you add it like this to any React project. Thereafter, we can restart npm start. And now let's start very simple and see this in action. For this, I'll not even start with the modal for now, but we'll also soon animate this again. But I'll add a button here, and that button should simply show or hide a nice little block, a div with a background color. So there I'll say toggle, and below that toggle I want to render a div. Now first of all, let me simply add show block here in the state, and initially that is false, let's say. And then here below the button, I'll check this state show block. If it is true, I'll add a div here. If it is false, I'll render null like this. Now this div will receive some inline style here with double curly braces to basically pass a JavaScript object. And in that JavaScript object, I'll set the background color to red. And additionally, I'll set the width to 100, which will be interpreted as pixels, and the height to 100. Now with that, let's hook up this button, and on a click on this button, I'll actually simply execute a method here. In this method, I'll execute this set state in the function version where I get the previous state, and then simply return a JavaScript object where show block is set to not previous state show block, like that. So now I'm basically just toggling between the display of the block. If we click this button here, we do instead see and hide that. And to make this a little bit less ugly, I'll also add a line break below our button here. Should be a self-closing element though, so that now it sits above open modal. Like that. Let's also quickly add margin auto to our div so that it is centered. And let's give our button this button class name here to also improve its styling a little bit. Now with all of that, if we save this, we got our toggle button toggling this red block. Now it might not have enhanced the look of our application, but now we can use this block to start playing around with the React Transition package we just installed. If we check out the documentation, we see that this package exports one important component. It actually exports more than that, but we'll start with this one, that transition component. Now let me show you how this works. First of all, in my app.js file, I will import it. So I will import transition. You can name this whatever you want. It's a default export, but I'll stick to transition from React transition group / transition. So that's a sub package which gives us this transition component. Now we use this transition component to wrap what we want to animate. In our case, that's this div here. For that, let me temporarily get rid of our check here whether we want to render this or not. Let's say we're always rendering this. And instead, let's add the transition component and wrap the div with it like this. That alone won't do much, but we can now use this transition component to control the display of elements inside of it, and especially the animation of these elements. We do this if we have a look at the documentation, by setting this in property. That's an important one. This decides whether the elements wrapped inside the transition component should be shown or not. And the transition component simply manages 4 internal states: entering, entered, exiting, and exited, which we then again can listen to decide how our element should be shown. Sounds very strange. Let me show you how it works. So first of all, let's add this important in property to the transition component. In determines whether the wrapped element should be visible or not. So therefore, for our div here, we should bind it to show block. Only if show block is true, this div inside the transition component should be rendered. We also got another important property we have to set on the transition component: timeout. Now, timeout simply is a time value which determines how long this animation should be played. Or to be precise, since transition on its own doesn't play anything but just manages these 4 states I mentioned, timeout simply determines how long it takes to switch from entering to entered and from exiting to exited. And it's this in-between thing you can then animate. So here, let's say timeout should be 300, and that will be interpreted as milliseconds. Now with that, what happens is that inside the transition component, we can render something dynamic with curly braces, because inside there we now actually should render a function. That's what the transition component in the end gives us back. Values we can use in a function, or only one value to be precise: the state. So in the simplest form, what we can do here, we can simply write an arrow function. That is why we need the curly braces. This arrow function should then of course return the JSX we actually want to render. And that could be a paragraph which outputs that state. Again, wrapped in curly braces since we're inside JSX code here again. Now I'll temporarily cut the div here to keep it in memory but remove it. Now with that, if we also fix the error I just saw, that in of course should be bound to this state show block. The show block properties in our state. So now with that, if we save this and we go back to our application, we see that we see exited there. Because I am just outputting some text here with my paragraph where I output the state value which is given to us by this transition component. Let's see which other values this state value or argument can have. If I click toggle, you see it first switched to entering and then to entered. If I click toggle again, it's first exiting and then exited. And if that's too fast, simply bump up the timeout to, let's say, 1 second to have a little bit more time. Now if we click toggle, we see it's entering, entered, exiting, exited. And that's all this transition component does for you. It manages this state argument it gives to you in a function you pass as a child of the transition component. And this managed state property takes your timing into account. Now with that, we can of course go back to rendering a div in there, but not actually in there like this, but instead in our function here. So in this function where we get the state, I actually want to return a div. And now we know that state is entering, entered, exiting, or exited. We can of course take advantage of this to now manipulate our style depending on the state. So for example here, we could say that we want to set the opacity of this element to, and if the state is, let's say, equal to exited, then the opacity should be 0, otherwise it should be 1. Now let's see this in action. If I save this, now you see the div is still there. It's taking up its space, but it's not visible. If I toggle it, it's shown again. If I click toggle again, it disappears after this 1 second. Still, we got no animation right now, but we can see how we can use this transition component. Obviously, it would be much nicer to have an animation though. Now, to add this animation, we just need to tweak this a little bit. We simply have to add the transition property you already learned about. And let's say we want to animate any changes in the opacity property. We could also use all. So let's go back to opacity though. Let's say we want to animate this over 1 second using the same value as we use here in timeout, 1000 milliseconds. And we want to do this with these out. And all of that should be a string. If we save this, now if I toggle this, you see it's animated in and animated out. Now we got one important thing. We're controlling this animation with the transition. It's still always staying in the DOM though. But we can control this by adding more props to the transition component. We can add mount on enter, which simply is a Boolean prop, which says, yeah, if the in property is set to true, you should add the wrapped element to the DOM. And on the other hand, you can add unmount on exit to really remove it from the DOM if that's not true. If we now save this, you see no empty space, it's gone. But if we now click toggle, it's there again. If we click toggle again, it's removed. Still no animation due to the way we're controlling this. We're only changing the opacity here when the state is exited, which is too late. If we set this to exiting instead, which is entered right at the beginning, we click the toggle button to remove it. Now you see it fades out. So now we fixed the issue we had before. We still have an instant animation for showing it because we're not setting the style on that. But for removing it, we're taking advantage of these 4 different states, or actually the 2 different states for removing the element, exiting and exited. And as soon as we start exiting, we already set the opacity to 0 and we animate this, but it's not actually removed from the DOM until the entire animation, so this timeout here, is over. And now we really tell React to only remove this element after the given period with the help of this transition component. Now that was a lot of new knowledge. Let's apply this to our modal so that this hopefully becomes a bit clearer.